From the outside, my family seemed typical growing up, but inside it felt as though we lived in two different universes. By a year, I was the older sibling, but compared to my sister Laura, it felt as though I belonged in a quite different world. Laura came into our house defined by a complicated collection of health problems and chronic diseases. Her life consisted of visits to doctors, treatments, and ongoing care. Though it came at a cost, my parents did everything they could to simplify her life. I knew why. More usually than not, I was left to fend for myself. Ever since I could remember, I was labeled as the easy one, the healthy child who didn't need the same degree of attention. That moniker carried expectations to be independent, calm, and sympathetic. Laura's days were full of scheduled special events meant to meet her demands, but I was usually overlooked. While my parents drove Laura to events or appointments, I would find myself left with neighbors or dropped off at my Aunt Grace's house. Usually promises I would be able to join next time went through, and soon I stopped believing there would ever be a next time. It wasn't only the major events highlighting this disparity. From visiting a movie as a family to playing at the park, Laura's entire existence focused around what she could control. She needed that attention, and I felt bad about resenting it. Yet the sense of being forgotten was difficult to overcome. My 9th birthday is still one that truly stung. There was no festivity or special feast. Though my parents had taken Laura to see a concert she had been looking forward to for months, the day passed without much more than a happy birthday. I woke up eager, thinking maybe there was a surprise in store. Late on their way home, they animatedly discussed how wonderful it was. I sat there, unseen as always. My mom discovered they had missed my birthday just the next day. She said apologies and presented me with a $5 gift card for makeup. It was something, but the message was quite clear. My benchmarks took second place. Years passed, and this trend continued. Every birthday, every accomplishment that ought to have been honored, became just another day. I never even bothered suggesting what I wanted by the time my 10th birthday arrived. I had learned not to expect anything unique. The day I turned 10 was particularly unpleasant. I went through the grind of school and arrived home to see my parents too busy with Laura's awful week to even mention happy birthday until much later. That quick embrace and thank you felt like a secondary consideration. That day, a surprise ice cream treat at lunch helped my schoolmates save me. Not much, but it made me visible, even if only momentarily. By the time I was 12, my expectations had dropped so low that I stopped expecting anything at all. That birthday went with just a murmured, "Happy birthday," and a few minutes of my parents' attention before they turned back to schedule Laura's next doctor's visit. Their neglect was not motivated by malice. Rather, it was a habit of placing my needs second, a pattern that had ingrained itself into our family dynamics. My school performance, interests, and modest accomplishments were typically greeted with a distracted nod or a quick word before being discounted. Disappointment grew to be resignation with time. I began to retreat, spending more time at the homes of friends or alone. Full of decor, cake, and laughter, my friends' birthday festivities were a terrible window into what family gatherings can be like. It wasn't until years later, during a family therapy session, that a therapist pointed out how these events reflected my parents' distorted priorities rather than merely minor mistakes. I loved those times and hated going back to the silence of my own house. During those meetings, I came up expressing emotions I had buried for years. As I grew older, my perspective on my family dynamic strengthened. My parents listened, remorse written on their faces, but old habits die hard and vows to change frequently faded beneath the weight of daily living. It was everything that made me feel like a whole person, not only birthdays or major events that were discounted. The little letdowns turned into a continual background hum that helped to shape me. I began to notice how varied the families of my acquaintances were when I entered middle school. Cheering them on with wide smiles and real enthusiasm, their parents arrived at scientific fairs, school plays, and soccer events. Conversely, my parents were practically absent all the time. The few times they did show up felt forced, as if they were checking a box so they could hurry back to look after Laura. One game in particular comes to mind where I scored the winning goal. My buddies raised me, the audience burst, and I looked for my parents on the sidelines. They vanished from sight. Though it was nice, the mother of a classmate gave me an encouraging thumbs up, which was not the same. When I brought it up at supper that evening, my dad remarked, "Sorry, champ, you know how it is." And I did. That exactly how it was. I nodded, trying to downplay the familiar lump in my throat. My sister was not a villain in my narrative. When Laura felt good, she was charming and humorous. We did have times when we were just siblings playing board games or cracking jokes. She began, however, leaning toward the attention she received as her health problems grew more complicated. I believe it was a survival instinct, a means for her to carve out some authority in a life when so much was out of her control. But Laura understood precisely how to bring it back if the emphasis ever turned to me, even for a brief while. She would comment or unexpectedly ask for aid, and just like that, my moment would vanish. The weight of this reality caused me to create coping skills. With after-school sports, debate club, anything to keep me out of the house, I stayed busy. Places where I was known and where my voice had weight brought solace to me. Teachers, coaches, and even the parents of friends filled in some of those voids. The loneliness was relentless even with the minor but necessary encouragement that Mr. Thompson, my English instructor, would always draw me aside to remark, "Great job on that essay, Matt." Conversations at home focused mostly on Laura's most recent treatment, her difficulties, or whatever fresh therapy my parents were seeking to have authorized by the insurance company. I would add stories on my day, only for my remarks to fade into the background hum. One day, in an attempt to grab even a piece of their attention, I brought up my plans for a school trip I had been saving up for all year. My mom would nod absent-mindedly, her eyes already back on her phone or paperwork deep in the details of Laura's care. "It's to the State History Museum," I answered, attempting to give my voice some thrills. "I'll even get to stay overnight." My mom looked up, her eyebrows knitting together. "That sounds great, honey, but given Laura's situation, you know that varies. If she's steady, we'll try to make it work." I nodded, acting not to care, but inside it stung. What "we'll try" meant already was clear to me. Indeed, Laura had a nasty spell, and my mother missed the parent information session when the trip date rolled around. I missed the vacation, and the "we'll try" melted away. As the years passed, I grew used to lowering my expectations. My classmates returned with stories, mementos, and pictures. I sat quietly, listening and acting as though it didn't hurt. I simply expected less. It was not that I stopped desiring things. When things did go my way, it seemed almost shocking. Just the two of us, like the day Grandpa popped up unannounced to go fishing. Among the nicest afternoons I have ever had in life. Though we discussed everything, from his days in the Navy to his favorite books, and I felt seen, really seen for the first time in what felt like eternity. These events were few and far between, and the solitude began to etch itself deeper into me. I gave up attempting to talk about a book I enjoyed or communicate my enthusiasm about a project I was working on in school. Why should I bother? The tipping point came one evening when I was home trying to relax after a demanding week. Though my parents nodded or gave a brief, "That's great, Matt," I could see their minds were somewhere else, always on Laura. Having saved money for a secondhand game console, it had evolved into my haven and escape. Laura was angry, in more discomfort than normal, and struggling that evening. Focusing on my game, I tried to ignore it, but all of a sudden, she stormed into my room in a rage of frustration. She grabbed my controller, dropped it, and yelled about how unfair everything was before I could respond. The sound of the controller striking the floor sounded like a snap of something breaking inside me. Stunned, I sat there staring at the broken fragment of the only item really mine. That night, I lay in bed, the weight of everything bearing down on me. My parents hurried in. Instead of addressing what had just happened, they immediately carried Laura out to cool her off, muttering promises to her as they left me alone in the room, mute and forgotten. It was about years of being pushed aside, of learning that my feelings came second, if they counted at all. The boiling resentment I had kept bottled up for so long started to come out, and I knew something had to happen. The broken controller was only one aspect. The days after that evening were tense and full of an uncomfortable stillness. I was bored with simply living in my own house and felt like an outsider in my own story. My parents avoided what had happened, tiptoeing around me and casting uneasy looks in my direction. They could more easily pretend everything was under control. To escape the stifling silence at home, I put my head down and concentrated on school, spending more time at friends' houses. But the bitterness had rooted itself. I discovered myself skipping family dinners and snapping at small events. Ignorant of the underlying deeper problem, my parents wrote it off as normal teenage anxiety. I wanted so desperately to tell my dad everything, to let him know it wasn't only about a broken gaming console one night when he inquired whether I was okay. But years of feeling neglected kept the words from getting through my throat. I thus just said and shrugged, "Yeah, I'm fine." Eventually, I hit a breaking point. Family therapy is what I recommended. Other children had mentioned it in class, and it sounded like a shot in the dark. But I was ravenous for anything that may change things. To my astonishment, my folks consented. Our first therapy session seemed like entering uncharted ground. Perhaps they realized how disconnected I had grown, or felt guilt chewing at them for years of missed events. Comfortable chairs and a professional-looking therapist sat across from us in the bright but austere room. Beginning with each of us to discuss what we hoped to get out of therapy, Dr. Reynolds asked with composure and eyes that appeared to read straight through you. First were my parents, who discussed wanting to improve communication and reconnect. I inhaled deeply when it came time and whispered, "I just want to feel like I matter too." The stillness that followed was deafening. My dad moved uneasily in his chair while my mother's eyes grew wide. Dr. Reynolds nodded and started noting. That I felt like an afterthought in my own family was the first time I had expressed it aloud. The next few sessions went rather difficult. Though their guards were on, my parents listened. They discussed how challenging Laura's illness was to manage, and how they were doing the best they could under trying conditions. As the sessions went on, Dr. Reynolds urged us to be more honest, understanding that the neglect would not be any more palpable. Sitting in that room with emotions exposed was unusual at first, but it also felt freeing. I discussed birthdays gone uncelebrated, educational successes that hardly got noticed, and the loneliness of feeling like an outsider. I watched real horror on the faces of my parents for the first time. My dad reached over and squeezed my shoulder while my mom started to cry and murmur, "I had no idea." Though minor, it felt like the first true acknowledgement of the sorrow Laura had carried for so long. We tried to make changes at home, beginning with a promise to spend more time as a family, not only time focused on Laura's needs, but times including me too. Our first try at it was to see a movie. Though it felt forced, everyone was on edge, it was a start. Whether it was a basic movie night or game playing, we started organizing a weekly family activity. I let myself momentarily imagine things would turn around, but Laura observed the change. She first appeared to be apathetic, yet a little tension developed when the emphasis veered even slightly off her. It began with offhand remarks like, "I'm glad you guys had fun without me," when she remained home on a trip. Her comments came out as harsh, veiled under a thin layer of humor. One evening at supper, everything came to a head. My parents would answer with regretful apologies, ensuring her it was only one-time occurrence. We were seated around the table, exchanging daily events. Laughing as my dad related a ridiculous error he had made at work, I experienced a rare sense of involvement. Laura then cut in, her voice trembling, "It's nice that everyone's so happy while I'm stuck dealing with this." The table was silent. Panic passed between my parents, and the guilt swept over their features like a tsunami. Promising they hadn't overlooked her needs, my mother hurried to soothe her. The usual sensation of being pushed aside returned, encircling me like an old, unpleasant blanket. I dropped my fork and left the table directly toward my room. The next therapy session was stressful. I heard whispers, and the odd sound of Laura crying all night interspersed with my parents' subdued attempts to calm her down. Observing the change, Dr. Reynolds inquired as to whether anything had happened. I hesitated, but my mom started first. "Laura feels like we're not paying enough attention to her," she remarked, eyes flitting between Laura and me. The emphasis changed once more to Laura's worries and fears. I wanted to yell, to declare that this was precisely what I had feared, that even in trying to establish balance, my needs would be pushed aside to calm the tension. I sat back, hardly listening. The tiredness of it all crept deep into my bones. I kept silent, observing the drama play out, thinking that even with my voice, it was insufficient to change the direction of our family dynamics. Therapy felt like a circle of guilt, apologies, and half-hearted attempts at change, always returning to Laura's needs, which dominated everything. Though I knew my parents were trying, the years of habit were difficult to eradicate, and Laura's response simply served to reinforce their old habits. As the weeks stretched into months, the therapy sessions persisted, but their influence began to fade. I started to question if change was even conceivable, or if I would always be the second consideration in my own family. What started as a hopeful try to heal the rifts in our family evolved into a pattern whereby the same problems kept coming up. Less and less I spoke, since I felt as though my words did nothing except stir the pot. At home, the change I had hoped for was erasing. The session seemed like a play I'd seen too many times, predictable, draining, and finally, useless. As Laura's objections became increasingly regular, the weekly family activities shrank. Every time we scheduled something unrelated to her, conflict developed. Driven into their cycle of guilt and obligation, my parents began to give her comfort top priority once more. Watching a steady, unavoidable fallback into the old normal seemed like observing. One evening, the last straw arrived. Simple family game night, something I had been looking forward to, was scheduled to happen. But Laura had been whining about aches and tiredness all day in a foul attitude. My mom laughed and remarked, "Why do you all even bother?" as soon as she asked whether she wanted to join us. "You only do these things because of Matt." The room fell still. The shame flashed across my parents' features as the tension buzzed in the air. My dad turned to me right away and said, "Let's do this another time, okay?" I sat there experiencing the usual sting. I agreed and got up without arguing. My throat was tight as I turned away. The rage erupted in my room, blending with an unhappiness I could not seem to shake. It was about every time I had been urged to move aside, wait, be patient, not only about the gaming night. The next day during therapy, I let go. I knew I was tired from trying to fit into a place that was never mine to start with. I told Dr. Reynolds everything that had happened the evening before and expressed my sense of nothing changing. I said I was weary of bending myself into a form that fit the margins of our family and of being the second thought. My parents listened. Their emotions combined shame with powerlessness. Laura crossed her arms and set her gaze on the floor. "I know you're trying," I muttered, sounding shaky. "But when it always ends the same, attempting is insufficient." Dr. Reynolds nodded, then fixed her eyes on my parents. "Matthew's emotions must be validated rather than merely accepted. How far are you ready to go to bring about permanent changes?" My mother wiped at her tears. "We are trying to balance everything," she added gently. "Laura shouldn't feel neglected, but what about Matt?" Dr. Reynolds pushed. The unanswered and weighty question hovered in the air. At a loss for what to say, my parents exchanged looks. Laura shifted uneasily and said, "It's not fair to act like I'm the problem." I tightened my jaw, stifling a response. It was about at last being seen, not about casting her as the villain. But I knew at that instant I was past attempting to persuade everyone. Years of feeling invisible pressed down on me, and I realized I needed a different solution, one that didn't rely on anybody else changing. In the days that followed, I started pulling back, concentrating on activities that brought me delight outside of my family. I joined more clubs, stayed more in class, and, whenever I could, began hanging out with friends. I started visiting my buddy Sam's house often. His mother always greeted me warmly and set aside a seat at their table. It felt like an oasis, a taste of what home ought to feel like. My folks noted my absence. Late at night, my dad would knock on my door, asking how I was or if I wanted to chat. I said, constantly exhausted, which was not totally a lie. One evening, after weeks of tense silences and half-hearted chats, my mom tried to reach out. I was tired of rehashing the same talks that led nowhere, tired of feeling like I was asking for too much just by trying to matter. "Matt, we are going to work with another therapist." I stared at her, the words weighty in my chest. Maybe a fresh viewpoint would help. She looked optimistic, desperate even. "I don't want to go," I whispered softly. Her face dropped, the optimism in her eyes flickering like a candle in the wind. She was done trying to fix something that always goes back to the same place. She added, nearly begging, "But we can't just give up." I responded, "I'm not giving up." We stood there, the stillness between us loaded with things none of us knew how to say. "I'm just done trying to fix something that only breaks me." Though they were locked in a pattern they could not escape, no matter how many promises they made, my parents yearned so desperately to change things. Laura, too, couldn't see beyond her own world to grasp what sharing space truly meant. It was then that I realized I had to venture outside, not just physically, but also emotionally. It was time to quit waiting for my family to evolve and begin creating something different for me. The choice to cut off my family wasn't simple, but it was essential, since I wanted to live where I wasn't an afterthought and where I could be the main character in my own story. I needed space to breathe, to discover my identity outside the shadow of my sister's needs. The first step was turning my future front first. Not only for academics, but also as a ticket out, a means to create a place where I could be seen for who I was. I threw myself into schooling. My preoccupation became college applications, investigating scholarships, preparing for tests, and crafting essays with a narrative vastly different from the one my family knew stayed late. It was the tale of someone who had discovered perseverance the hard way, someone who yearned for more than just survival. I wanted to flourish. When I at last was accepted into a college in a city hours away, I felt both relief and anxiety. My parents smiled tightly and conflictedly, congratulating me. The months before my departure were oddly calm. My mother embraced me a little too long and said, "We're proud of you, Matt." And I nodded, feeling the unspoken words between us. The understanding that this step meant more than just going to college. It meant putting distance between us. Though there was underlying conflict, my parents tried to act normal, discussing packing lists and what I would need for my apartment. Laura mostly turned away from the subject. Though it wasn't much, she appeared bothered by the attention my leaving was attracting. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed one evening as I packed boxes in my room. She continued, almost accusingly, "So you're really leaving?" "Yeah," I responded, not looking up. "It's time." She simply observed me with an attitude I couldn't quite interpret. She turned then and headed away, her footsteps resounding down the corridor. Moving day came and went with sad goodbyes and pledges to stay in touch. The conversation stopped as suddenly as it began, a fitting emblem of our relationship, unfinished and full of holes. Though I had no idea what would follow, the moment I entered my room I felt a surge of independence. The silence of the small space seemed different, not oppressive. I gently went through my belongings, appreciating the fact this was my sanctuary. Not one interruption, not one subdued discussion regarding Laura's requirements, just me. The first 2 weeks were a flurry of courses, new friends, and the change to live a life on my own. I encountered people who knew nothing about my experience, who considered me as Matt, the man who made everyone laugh with his impressions and adored vintage rock tunes. Being known for more than simply the other sibling was exciting, but even with the increased autonomy, there were times when the silence felt weighty. I expected little on my birthday, yet it ached more than I would have desired when the day went without a call from home. I told myself it was useless as I was creating a new life free from their approval. Still, that night I sat on my bed with the silence of my phone screen teasing me. Now things were different. I called some pals and we went for burgers and milkshakes instead of descending into that old familiar loneliness. They turned the day around for me, but they were ignorant of it. We laughed until our sides hurt, and on my birthday, I went to bed feeling happy for the first time in years. Over time, the distance from my family provided clarity. I came to see that even though I loved them, I had to give myself top priority in a manner I had never done. I set limits, but I still stayed in touch, phoning my parents occasionally now. I would modify the topic or cut the call short if discussions veered too much into the same patterns. Though they noted, they did not press. One summer, I returned home for a visit. Perhaps they realized I needed this space as much as they needed to negotiate their life without me always under consideration. Being back in the house that had molded so much of who I was felt unusual. The same procedures were in place, the same emphasis on Laura's needs. This time, though, I resisted allowing it to swallow me. On the last night of my visit, I sat in the kitchen with my mother. I visited friends, spent time at the park, and even encountered Mr. Thompson, my former English teacher, who beamingly proud of how far I had gone. The distant sound of a TV show Laura was seeing in the living room permeated the room, along with the quiet hum of the refrigerator. My mother started the quiet breaking, her voice tight with emotion. "It's different without you here," she remarked. "I know," I answered. "It's different for me, too." We didn't say little after that, but it felt like a little step toward understanding. Not perfect, not a repair, but an appreciative moment. And that was enough for now. I felt calm as I drove back to campus under the distant city lights. I had no idea whether my connection with my family would ever be what I wanted it to be. One thing, though, I knew for sure. I had discovered a life in which I mattered, and in which I was more than simply a background detail. And that represented a beginning worth clinging to.